Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I wanted to do my first video, or I guess this is actually my second video in my series I wanted to do about William Faulkner. So in my first video about Faulkner, I basically said I wanted to do a video about three themes that recur in Faulkner's work. Those are the themes of social class, history, and race. And so today I want to talk about social class in Faulkner's work. So before I start talking about this, I don't think you have to know this stuff before reading Faulkner, and I don't think it's that you can't pick up on this stuff yourself by reading Faulkner. But I do think that a little bit of extra knowledge maybe about Southern history in these areas and the South in these areas can kind of enhance the understanding, appreciation of Faulkner and his works. So today I wanted to do social class. So I think the key to understanding social class in the South is understanding that the South's economy remained rooted in agriculture, you know, at the very least, well into the 1920s and 30s, and probably after that. And an agricultural based economy generates wealth through land ownership. So, you know, to simplify things, the more land you owned, the more potential wealth you had. And the South remained this way as the North was industrializing. And so what happens is, if wealth is based on land ownership and social class is related to wealth, then social class is related to land ownership. And this was much more fixed in the South than it was in the North. In the North, as cities begin to grow and industrialization takes hold, it was possible to earn money and to achieve a higher social class without owning land. You know, just give you a simple example. You could move to a city, learn to be a bricklayer, live in an apartment, be a bricklayer your whole life, earn good middle class money, and move your family solidly into the middle class, and never actually own any land at all. In the South, this is much more difficult. So before the Civil War, there are essentially 5 social classes in the South. There's a social class which I'm going to call, in a lot of history books refer to as the planter class. These are kind of the plantation-owning Southerners. They own, you know, hundreds of acres of land. They own dozens of slaves. They are the wealthy elite of Southern society before the Civil War. They're the ones who are making the money. They're the ones getting elected to lead Southern states. When the Civil War comes, oftentimes these are the ones who become colonels and generals in the Confederate Army. Below them would be a social class kind of much harder to define, kind of like defining today maybe upper middle class. And those would be kind of smaller land and slaveholders. They own land, significant amounts of land, and they owned a significant number of slaves, but they really hadn't achieved this kind of planter class status. So the social class below the small slaveholder would be the yeoman farmer class. These are, independent farming families. They own their own land. They don't own a whole lot of land, but enough to support themselves, enough to make a little extra money, you know, enough to not live in poverty, and to be independent. They were fiercely proud of this independence, quite frankly. And they are very different from the slave-owning classes. Yeoman farmers would be of a social class who didn't own any slaves at all. Yeoman farmers would have made up, you know, probably a good 60% of the Southern population before the Civil War. So we are talking then about the majority of the Southern population would be these yeoman farmers. Mixed into this social class would be like tradesmen and independent businessmen. But as a reminder, most cities in the South remained relatively small, so we don't see that growing middle class that is a part of life in the North and northern cities. We don't see that in the South. And then the poorest 10% of white Southerners would be people who are frequently in the South referred to as poor white trash. These were people who didn't own any land. They oftentimes squatted on the fringes of other people's land. They did odd jobs for money. They lived kind of out in the woods. And they were desperately, desperately poor. And then, of course, in the pre-Civil War South, below that social class, you had the enslaved population of African Americans who were brutalized and mistreated and, suffered tremendously under the yoke of slavery. So those were the 5 Southern social classes before the Civil War, and movement between those social classes was very, very difficult. You know, the planter class, to keep the land under their control, married other planter class people, and therefore it was very difficult to move up. It was difficult to earn enough money to buy more land and slaves, and so oftentimes what people in the South did to have a chance to move up economically and socially is they moved further west so that they would get a chance to become the large slave owners and the large landowners in the South. Well, the Civil War changed things, of course, because the Civil War ended slavery. Now, quickly, Southern landowners replaced the system of slavery with a system of sharecropping, in which they essentially turned newly freed African Americans who, in large ways, were economically abandoned by the United States government. They turned them into kind of debt slaves and caught them up in a system which was almost impossible to free themselves. But I don't want you to get the impression that that wasn't better than slavery. It certainly was. So then also this group of poor white trash, the landless white Southerners, oftentimes find themselves being involved in sharecropping as well, which is a system which isn't necessarily any more fair to them than it was to African Americans, but of course they don't face the stigma of racism and racist violence, and they don't face the possibility of lynching as African Americans did. And then there's this kind of blending, I think, of the group of kind of the yeoman farmer, the tradesman, the small business owner, and those kind of smaller slave owner landowners who had kind of been right below the planter class. Some of these are going to become more wealthy. Some of these will drop down into the middle class or into that kind of yeoman farmer class in the South. And then the large landowners, those are the people who are most able to take advantage of sharecropping African Americans and sharecropping poor whites. Well, one of the things about social class in the South before the Civil War is it was fixed, but the Civil War then ends all that. And so I think a lot of times what Faulkner talks about in his work is this kind of social class tension and confusion and this greater fluidity among the social classes. And so you see people, the characters in his novels, no matter what social class they're coming from, in some ways kind of struggling against what used to be social class norms and trying to figure out the new social class norms. To give you an example from a Faulkner book I've already reviewed and talked about on my channel, in The Unvanquished, the young Bayard Sartoris is a member of this planter class. He's a member of the upper class in Southern society. His father owned slaves, his father's a colonel in the Confederate Army, and he is expected to keep up those traditions. In the beginning of that novel, young Bayard follows his father's example, and he sticks with those traditions. And so when his grandmother is killed, Bayard goes out and hunts down the man who killed her and kills him. But later in the novel, when his father is killed by his father's business partner, Bayard has rethought things, and he's rethinking his father's approach, and he's questioning those old class values. And therefore he refuses to kill his father's former business partner, and instead he lets him escape. In other words, this is a member of the upper social class finding it necessary to change and maybe rethink their ideas about class after the Civil War. This middle class group is the hardest kind of to find, I think, in Faulkner. You can find this in the Compson family from The Sound and the Fury, is an example of a family who probably was kind of near that upper tier of Southern society, but as the years after the Civil War have passed, they've fallen onto harder and harder times. So then we find kind of Jason Compson kind of stuck in this job, essentially working as in a hardware store and trying to hold on to, in some ways and in bad ways, the reputation of his family. And then he becomes desperate, and he does things like stealing and lying, and essentially he becomes a cheat to try to hold on to whatever social class status they could have. But the characters I think you find most often in Faulkner who are struggling with these kind of social class changes that come after the Civil War are those poorer members of Southern society. So, for instance, in As I Lay Dying, Faulkner basically tells the story of the Bundren family's attempt to bury their dead mother, and the father, Ance Butler, appears on the surface to be, and he is, a fairly unpleasant, not very admirable, and maybe even somewhat lazy, selfish person, but he has this kind of pride that a yeoman farmer would have. And this is why when the Bundrins are offered help, he frequently refuses to take that help. So from As I Lay Dying, we see a scene which is actually narrated by not a member of the Bundrin family, kind of about Anne's Bundrin. And so he is offered help, and he and his family will insist on either paying for the assistance they get or just refuse it altogether. So here we go from As I Lay Dying. So I told them to drive it into the barn because it was threatening rain again and that supper was about ready, only they didn't want to come in. I thank you, Bundrin says. We wouldn't want to discommode you. We got a little something in the basket we can make out. Well, I says, since you are so particular about your women folks, I am too, and when folks stops with us at mealtime and won't come to the table, my wife takes it as an insult. So the girl went on to the kitchen to help Rachel, and then Jewel come to me. Show, I says, help yourself out in the loft, feed him when you bait the mules. I'd rather pay you for him, he says. What for, I says. I wouldn't begrudge no man a bait for his horse. I'd rather pay you, he says. I thought he said extra. Extra for what, I says. Won't he eat hay and corn? Extra feed, he says. I feed him a little extra, and I don't want him beholden to no man. You can't buy no feed for me, boy, I says. And if he can eat that loft clean, I'll help you load the barn onto the wagon in the morning. He ain't never been beholden to no man, he says. I'd rather pay you for it. And if I had my rathers, you wouldn't be here at all, I said. But I just says, then it's high time, he commenced. You can't buy no feed from me. How about you boys, I says. You got a full day tomorrow. After a while, Cash says, I thank you. We can make out. We wouldn't want to be beholden, Bundrin says. I thank you kindly. So here is Bundrin, a member of that kind of proud yeoman class of southern farmers, essentially refusing assistance, or at least refusing, in some ways, as much assistance as he thinks would compromise his dignity. And that dignity of kind of this poor southern independent farming class is an important aspect of life in the South. Below those poor landowning Southerners are the people who used to be poor white trash, who frequently were white men who found themselves caught up in the sharecropping system, and no better example of those exists than the Snopes family. There are 3 whole novels about the Snopes family, the Snopes saga, which is the hamlet, the town, and the mansion, in which the main character, Flem Snopes, uses every method he can think of to advance his family, to advance himself. He cheats, he steals, he takes vengeance on those who have dared to act like they were better than him and his family, and he does everything he can to raise himself up, not for the pleasure of being necessarily more successful, but so that he can look down on those who've looked down on him. The Snopes family appears not only in those novels, but also in a series of stories, or in some of the Faulkner short stories. And the story that features the Snopes family the most is a story called Barn Burning. And in that story, a character named Ab Snopes basically is a sharecropping farmer who goes from farm to farm and works on other people's land and lives in homes on their property. And he resents it so much that anything he thinks, anything he takes as a slight to his dignity as a man, results in him taking some kind of violent action, which, from the name of the story, Barn Burning, you should be able to guess what it is that he actually does. So, in the story, the story starts off with Ab Snopes more or less being on trial for burning down a man's barn and having a judgment made against him in which he has to pay that man, his former landlord, back, and then moving his family to another shack on the property of another man named Major Despain, who he has to go and talk with and negotiate the deal they've made under the sharecropping agreement. And as soon as he goes to that man's, Major Despain's house, it is almost clear that he is determined to make trouble there as well. So from Barn Burning, the door opened so promptly that the boy knew the Negro must have been watching them all the time, an old man with neat grizzled hair and a linen jacket who stood barring the door with his body, saying, "Wipe your foots, white man, fo you'll come in here. Major ain't home nohow." "Get out of my way, inward," his father said, without heat too, flinging the door back and the Negro also, and entering, his hat still on his head. Notice he doesn't take his hat off in Major Despain's head. Now the boy saw the prints of the stiff foot on the door jamb and saw them appear on the pale rug behind the machine-like deliberation of the foot, which seemed to bear or transmit twice the weight of the body compassed. The Negro was shouting, "Miss Lula! Miss Lula!" Somewhere behind them the boy, deluged as though through a warm wave by a suave turn of carpeted stair and a pendant glitter of chandeliers and a mute gleam of gold frames, heard the swift feet and saw her too, a lady, perhaps he'd never seen her like before either, in a gray smooth gown, with lace at her throat, and an apron tied at the waist, and the sleeves turned back, wiping cake or biscuit dough from her hands with a towel as she came up the hall, looking not at his father at all, but at the tracks on the blonde rug, with the expression of incredulous amazement. "I tried," the Negro cried. "I told him to." "Will you please go away?" she said in a shaking voice. "Major Despain is not home. Will you please go away?" His father had not spoken again. He did not speak again. He did not even look at her. He stood stiff in the center of the rug in his hat, the shaggy iron-gray brows twitching slightly above the pebble-colored eyes as he appeared to examine the house with brief deliberation. Then, with the same deliberation, he turned. The boy watched him pivot on the good leg and saw the stiff foot drag round the arc, the turning, leaving a final, long, fading smear. His father never looked at it. He never once looked down at the rug. So here is his father, essentially put off by the fact that he's come to see Major Despain and been greeted at the door by an African-American servant. And, you know, suffice to say, things don't go well from then, and there's another fire, and the Snopes family finds itself displaced over and over again. Ab Snopes in the story is so prideful that he ruins his family over and over and over again. And while his son is desperate that his father not continue to do this, and he sees the damage he's done, he still loves his father, and he still loves that pride his father has in some ways. So that's an example then. That and the Snopes trilogy of novels are examples of kind of this poor white trash level of Southern society seeking to make a place for itself, refusing to perhaps be looked down on by other men. And the case of Flem Snopes determined to get out of that situation. And the way other people react to the Snopeses in these stories, the way people react to the Bundrans, is an example of their own social class ideas. Major Despain, when he confronts Ab Snopes about the rug, is completely beside himself and confused with how this man could dare to ruin his rug and behave in the way he did. The townspeople who are there to witness Ab Snopes' first trial at the beginning of the story are completely against him, that he's clearly gotten above his station and he's done something he's not supposed to do. The middle class and the other farmers who deal with the Bundren family as they make their way to Jefferson to bury their long-dead mother eventually are somewhat taken aback by the pride that the Bundrans have and their refusal to accept the help that is oftentimes offered, and that from their own social class they feel obligated to offer. That these social class interactions are what Faulkner is oftentimes writing about. It's what he's drawing our attention to. It's what he's saying is changing about the South. And I think understanding those things and those old social class ideas can make reading Faulkner a little bit more enriching and enlightening. Anyway, I hope you liked the video, and let me know what you think down in the comments section below.